I don't know how to describe it other than like a demon type of sound.
But it's silhouetted, hulking, every bit of 5.5 feet wide, 13 to 14 foot tall, pitch black.
The one thing that ran through my mind when I had this encounter was I don't have a big enough gun.
Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello everyone, welcome to Campfire Talk. This is where we sit around the fire, put our feet up with a cold drink, and let the conversation flow. Tom, do you have anything to announce before we get rolling?
I do. First thing we need to do is let's throw another couple more dry logs on that crackling fire and get that thing going. But I want to thank everybody again for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Just so you know, the show is for you guys. It's your show, not ours. And if you like the show, let us know. There's a hungry algorithm out there that will live and die by you liking and subscribing. So if you like the show, please click the like button, share it. And if you haven't subscribed already, click the subscribe and click the bell so that you get all the latest updates from us. And if you want to go the extra step, you can do that. It helps us a bunch to help you. And that is patreon.com/Creek Devil. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, we always have a link in the description. You just click on that. Either one of those, you follow your nose, and it'll take you over to our Patreon page. So with that long-winded intro, I'm going to pass it back to you, Will.
You know, we were chatting before we started this, and I wanted to start out we're talking a little bit about truth. And everybody has a real, at least I do, and I'm sure everybody kind of has in their concept, when you hear the word truth, you know, I think we all think, okay, truth is either something it is real or it's not real. It's kind of a black and white topic, right? Well, apparently not. I was doing some research, and there apparently are two theories of truth. One is called the performance theory of truth, and I'll just give a light outline, and anybody can look these up. Performance theory of truth equals a pronouncement of something as true made in a statement by those in authority, academia, media, politicians, police, etc. In other words, if people in authority don't think something is true, like the term Bigfoot, then it's not true. Which seems kind of silly to me. That's your opinion. But I guess people in official positions can make a statement, and it holds a lot more water than, you know, Joe Average. Then there's something called the correspondence theory of truth. A statement is true if it corresponds to a current state of affairs. Now, I guess that could be taken as what we think of as having facts. You know, it's true if the facts support something. I guess it could be viewed differently as well. But and I kind of wish Tony were here, or the judge, to talk to us about that, because he's probably more familiar than we are with that. But what do you guys think? I mean, it kind of sums up the subject of Bigfoot, right? I mean, if the first one, if people don't believe in the subject, they make a statement, especially if they're in some form of authority, and by golly, it's not real. And I think the scientific community did that. You know, we see all these gatherings, you know, these, I can't remember what they call them, but where people get together and, you know, they discuss Bigfoot. And really, conferences, right. And I think mostly those are more designed these days to sell products or people's, you know, personalities or their ideas. You know, back in the 70s, when John Green and Renee DeHenden and those people, they were trying to get the scientific community off its butt to take a look at what they were finding in the field. And that was the whole idea of the conferences to begin with, but it's not what they've devolved into.
Well, I did a little bit of research on truth, and rather than defining truth, I went the opposite direction and what's the definition of a lie? And there's actually, it's interesting, there's three definitions. So one of them is commission, where you're making something up that's simply not true. Okay, omission. Yeah, a half-truth saying partly what is so by leaving out, major sections to manipulate the outcome. We won't mention, politicians or anything like that.
No, but it happens in this topic as well, because you get people out there that don't really know what they're talking about, but in order to support themselves as being an expert, they'll throw pieces of information out that are incomplete.
Absolutely. And then you get those who fake an agreement. They're being phony. They respond affirmatively to their input, but they don't actually believe it. Oh yeah, that sounds great, and it's not true, not factual.
Were you going to jump in there for us? I thought I heard you.
Well, yeah. I think that my own opinion here is truth sometimes is subjective as to the person that's telling it. What is truth to one person may not necessarily be truth to another. And I think if the judge was here, he might concur on that. You put people on the stand and they tell you exactly what they saw, and they tell them always to delete their feelings and such, but everybody always throws their feelings in, and you're going to be always affected by your upbringing, your environment, and opinions, sometimes even of other people that have been forced or even you've just heard in your lifetime. So when you tell the truth, it's all going to be influenced by that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, you can use these different angles to look at this topic and see a lot of what's going on out there.
Well, it's like, okay, for instance, in reference to Bigfoot, and I didn't mean to jump in, Tom, in the middle of your discussion there, because I know you always have good facts and everything. But okay, like Bigfoot, you have people that, and please don't be offended by this statement, but I always have to say this disclaimer. Okay, some people that are very, very religious, and I don't care whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or whatever, you may not want to accept that Bigfoot is a living, breathing entity, whether it be an archaic human or whether it is a bipedal ape. You might be affected by the fact that your upbringing, your Christian, your Muslim, your whatever Jewish upbringing, might affect you in a religious fashion, and you won't see these as being a living, breathing creature, but rather a demonic creature, because we do hear that sometimes.
You're absolutely right.
Yep.
And I have people that I've run into, actually, people that are, and there's a fourth category, the atheists, who are in the exact same camp for almost the same reason, that it has to be scientifically proven. I'm like, well, the problem with science is a moving target. I'm sorry, but it is. And what's scientific fact today, tomorrow is not the same fact. But also, I'm Christian, and majority of my friends are. And I find that they are quite often the ones who are most open to believing in their existence. Now, with that said, it doesn't answer the question. Yeah, they exist. Sorry, they do. Their existence is undeniable. But it really goes back to, what are they? And that's kind of the crux of the matter. I boiled it down to two categories, at least for myself. But I don't know how you prove that. Do you take the body of evidence and manuscripts on one side to support one category, or the body of evidence on the other side to support another category, or is there something in between?
Well, it kind of goes back to that foundation of truth that we talked about, because you have all kinds of different people out there who will pick one of those viewpoints, and that's what they stick with.
Yeah, exactly. And so I've been looking into this for quite some time, and there are manuscripts. The manuscripts, there's the dating of a manuscript falls into two basic categories. Number one, what is the date of the manuscript? And then number two, what is the content of the manuscript? So you may have a manuscript that goes back, for example, let's say 2300 years. Okay, that's the date of the manuscript. But that's not the date of the content of the manuscript. The content actually predates that maybe by several millennia. And so, again, it goes back to, well, if you have a manuscript that's 2,300 years old, for example, but they're talking about something that sounds like our creatures, and they're talking about something that goes back thousands of years prior to that.
Well, that's why I was kind of excited about chapter 17 of Ivan Sanderson's book, because his friend, who was the Jewish scholar, talked about that from the book of Genesis. When we see the book of Genesis in the Bible, it kind of, because there's a lot of information there, it kind of glosses over a lot of it. And for whatever reason they did that, we don't know, but and maybe people out there do, scholars, but when you talk to these folks who you look at the Jewish commentaries, and all this wealth of information is in there, and you see, where people look at the book of Genesis and say, well, it's the Nephilim. No, it's not the Nephilim, because when you look at what the Jewish commentaries say, they clearly identify at least two, maybe three different things in there. And the Nephilim were clearly not what these creatures are.
Well, speaking as a Jew, I can tell you that there's a definite distinction there. So
yeah, I was excited to see that. I thought, wow, that's really cool. I wished I could see more of that.
Well, yeah, exactly.
You go back to the Sumerian legend of Gilgamesh.
Right.
I mean, and gosh, for some reason, I'm having a senior moment right now. I can't remember Gilgamesh's friend and the hairy friend that he had in the woods. I mean, does that sound familiar? The hairy man of the woods.
Exactly.
That was his friend.
And that's something John Green in one of his books talked about. He brought that up, and he suggested very much so that that's probably what they were talking about in the story.
Exactly. So, I mean, we're talking, just like Tom said, legends and stories that have been around for thousands of years. And just because it was put down on paper yesterday doesn't mean that it hasn't existed in historical accounts for the millennia.
Exactly.
And over time, I think people will, when they use that information, they'll use it to make a point that they're making. And as an author, I've done that. I'll use a story to make a point that I'm making in a writing without necessarily, delving into the depths of that writing to make it clear to the reader, there's more to this than just the point I'm making.
Exactly.
So
and it is interesting that, I go back and forth, and I've talked about this. The manuscripts, the scrolls found at Qumran and along the Dead Sea, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's where like the Book of Giants and that sort of thing was found. And I read it, and for us, it's exactly what you said. You've got the hairy friend. I'm sitting there reading this. I'm like, oh my gosh. You got Nimrod and Gilgamesh. I'm not sure they're the same person, but you're talking pre-flood and post-flood of these things. And you're right. Bigfoot is not a Nephilim. It's something else. And there's other things out there that it's very interesting they're talked about there. And, if we want to get off of Bigfoot for just a moment, we can talk about the cryptids like Mr. Black has talked about. And those things are also described in these extra biblical manuscripts, these texts that sound an awful lot like what was going on back then is still going on today. So the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Book of Enoch.
Yes. I looked it up.
Yes.
I looked up the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Enkidu was the wild man.
Enkidu, yes. I actually had that I had a copy of that, and of course I lost it in my house fire. And I have never been able to find that edition that I had. Of course, I bought it long time ago. So they may not even have it out anymore.
Oh, it's still available. You can get it.
Oh, is it?
David, Chuck, what do you guys think?
Well,
I think we just put them to sleep.
We can do that.
I've never gone along with the whole Nephilim thing. I mean, to think that a spirit could impregnate a human female is just beyond bonkers to me. People are going to cling to what they want to believe, what they've got their mindset on. I mean, I don't know.
Well, to support that, the idea that, for one, we don't really know what a spirit is. But number two, again, I'm just going back to some of the biblical, this is specifically New Testament, but also in Old Testament. Paul talks about the disobedient spirits that left their abode. In the translation, as they left their tent, they had transformed themselves into they took a human form, and it really is the only explanation for what these things are. And then, there's other areas, in Psalms and places where God is excoriating these spirits, Elohim, for their disobedience, and said, "Yeah, you were spirits, but now you're going to die as men." And so it's there's something going on there. I'm kind of getting a little bit off.
Well, you have to kind of look at things with different cultures. I mean, I think the crux of these creatures, across history and even up to the present, are most people who've encountered them don't have anything in their frame of reference to explain what it is they've encountered. So your brain kind of gathers all these things it can to try to put this explanation together. And then a good example is the Wendigo, from the Plains Indians. And when you look at what the Wendigo was, it was these creatures. In popular culture and movies and things, they've added antlers and all kinds of crazy things to them. But what they were describing basically was a man animal. With these malevolent traits, which these creatures exhibit oftentimes.
Well, in historical accounts, you see even in the 1800s, 1700s, they're always referred to as hairy men. Mm-hmm. You didn't hear them saying ape men, because first off, people in that day and age didn't have they weren't even aware of apes. I mean, now, granted, some of them, were certainly aware of monkeys, and probably some of the people that were, especially the ones that were traveling the world in boats and such, they probably ran across gorillas and chimpanzees and such as that. But I mean, they didn't refer to them as ape men until the general public became aware of apes. And then all of a sudden in the culture, that word started creeping in, ape man, and you don't hear people referring to them as hairy men so much. It's the indigenous tribes that still use their original language for them.
Yeah, and you have to kind of look. I know when I was writing my first book, I was looking at some stuff from Central Washington and what the early natives there had to say, and it really depends on those people's point of view. And what I mean by that is up in the Snohomish area, I think it was, and I can't remember which tribe it was specifically there, but the writing was, and this was from the later 1800s, when whoever was doing the research and documenting what the natives were saying to them, they talked about 3 different kinds of people. Well, of course, the Sasquatch oftentimes was lumped in with quote-unquote people because of their physical appearance. So they talked about with the three categories of people, one was a civilized people. In other words, they had permanent encampments, and all that, all the supporting things that supported a community to be in a location for long periods of time. Then there were the more nomadic people, or less, how do they call it? Doggone it. They weren't as civilized as the people with the permanent homes and everything. Then there was a third category that was the complete wild. They were undomesticated. They apparently didn't wear clothes. They didn't have anything, not even language. And it just sort of seemed to me they were talking about these creatures, because all the things, the elements in that fit what these things are. But that was their outlook. It was very, very simple. It was very straightforward. And, it wasn't placing all these things that we do, different values on things that we do. They were just looking at what was there and said, well, this is what we got. These are the categories.
Well,
but here's what's important.
What I said about subjective truth.
Yeah, right.
They were talking about something.
Sure they were.
They weren't making stuff up. It was
matter of fact to them.
It was very matter of fact, and it wasn't just one or two tribes that ran into this. I think there was a anthropologist and archaeologist for the Forest Service. We had her on a few years back, and she had mentioned that she became a believer in the topic simply because there were so many words and descriptions for the exact same creature across hundreds of tribes going back hundreds of years.
Oh, yeah.
And, they didn't have mass media, Twitter, or anything else back then. So they're talking about something.
And the same holds true, really, with newspaper articles and magazines, things like that, going back to, I think Green noted his earliest article, I think, was 1811. But I'm pretty sure there are older ones, since then that were found. But when you look at that time period up until about the 1950s, that's when mass media sort of got connected all together and all this stuff started getting out to everyone. Prior to that time, these stories were basically localized stories. That was something maybe a local paper wrote about. They may have known the person, and maybe it was just an interest story for their paper, maybe a filler. But that was kind of the basis of these stories from a long time period, a couple hundred years.
And there was quite a few of those.
There were quite a few of them, yes.
There? A lot of them all over the place. One of the thoughts that I've wondered about is, I'm going to be hypothetical here because I don't want to ruffle feathers. But if you're the president and these stories, these accounts are going to filter up to him, the president's going to say, well, we need some group, some agency, I'll just say a bureau, to take a look at them and take a look at this and see what's really going on. And going back far enough and not that far, he had two options: either local police departments or the one and only federal bureau to handle this. And so I suspect that's where it's kind of landed on their desk to investigate this. They're the ones who had to, there had to be a place to centralize all the data coming in.
Well, I think it's best we let Mr. Black discuss all that on the new show that we're creating. He was familiar with that and involved in it. So, but I was talking prior to that. Like with the Indians, they were stating what it was they were seeing and experiencing, very matter of factly. There were also the settlers in these different regions who were doing the same thing. They weren't out broadcasting, hey, I saw this creature down here. We don't know what it is. The story would get out when something would happen to whoever wrote the articles. Sometimes it was letters, something John Green noted in his books. When people talk about things like, oh, well, how come we don't have a body? If they're real, we don't have a body. Well, if you look back and read Green's early books, he gives numerous examples of this where things were found. There was one, was a letter, and I can't remember if it was from this doctor or to this doctor. I think it was to a doctor, where someone found either bones or the creature. I don't recall offhand. I don't have, books are all packed up right now, so I don't know have the reference to it at hand, but they talked about this specimen and wanted to know if this doctor wanted the specimen, and they described, and I think it was bones. They described the size of the bones and all that, and no mention whether he actually took him up on it, but it was an example of things that were found. There were articles, there were magazine articles, newspaper articles, and then letters, and probably there's probably old, what do you call them, diaries and things like that. And I know I ran into a Forest Service office one time up in north central Oregon, and I just blurted out to the two guys working in there, I said, "If you guys heard any Bigfoot accounts lately?" And the one guy says, "Nah," just right offhand. And the other guy says, "Well, what about the family diary that we found up on the old homestead?" And he kind of looked at me, he says, "Oh yeah," that was interesting. Apparently this Bible they found, there was an old homestead up there. There wasn't much left of the homestead, but they had gone up there and they found the family Bible in there, and there were generations worth of information throughout this Bible where the family had noted, births and deaths and things like that, marriages, all that stuff. But he said throughout it was peppered stories about this wild man that had been seen frequently around the property. And this was, I think he said it was noted around the 1880s time frame. So there's probably a lot of information like that out there. We just don't have access to it because we don't know it's there.
Well, yeah, and I have a good relationship with at least two of the ranger districts, ranger stations here in Oregon, and I've never got a negative response from them. I've always got a very, not only a very positive response, but they're like, basically, yeah, they're out there. Our guys have seen them. And they're not, they get very serious when they talk about this. It's something that freaks them out.
Sometimes younger people will chuckle at first when you bring the topic up, but they at least listen to you.
Yeah.
Talking and discussing about all this, you've got reports in England that are thousands of years old, and they called him the wild man of the woods. And there's all kinds of stories about that kind of stuff back in those days.
Are you talking about the Woodwos? Or was that?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. The Green Man and the Woodwos.
Or was that France? I'm trying to think. Yeah, Europe was full of that kind of stuff.
Well, there's wood carvings in Europe of hairy men.
Yeah, there are. Apparently at one point, and I want to say it was around the 1300s, where practically everything was adorned with a woodwose carving or the wild man. It was that prevalent. Yes. Which kind of makes
it even goes back.
It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, they've been around.
I don't think it makes any of us wonder. I mean, I think we all know that they exist. It's just that I guess it's whether you want to be a believer or I used to say I was a believer, but I think it's more accurately to be put as I'm a knower.
Well, everybody on this panel has seen one. So it's not a matter of, it's not something metaphysical. We're not just believing something. I've seen the damn thing with my own eyes. I know what I'm talking about. And I'm not out to really convince anybody of that. My goal has been to collect enough evidence to support what I say.
Well, Will, your witness, or excuse me, your first encounter where you could actually see the feet, the veins in the feet. This was not somebody in a suit.
No, absolutely not. I could see the tendons move. There was, way too much. I'm a very detailed person, so when I see something, even for a short period of time like that, those details will really stick in my mind.
And Forrest, same thing with you. The one that it's intriguing. The first one you saw where it was blocking out the light and it was so tall, it's trying to, steal your AC or ripped the AC off, or I don't know what it was trying to do.
I have no idea what. Well, that wasn't the first one I ever saw. The first one I ever saw was actually across the road up north of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. But I didn't get. I was at the time jamming gears and everything else to try to stop it, and I mean he was just strolling across the interstate there. So going
have we
from one
heard
side
that
of the road to
story?
the other. Why does the Bigfoot cross the road? It's kind of like the chicken to get to the other side.
Because he can. Because he can.
Because he can.
Well, Forrest, have we
And he
heard
ain't
that
afraid
account?
of that big horse trailer coming down
stop
the road
me.
either.
Yeah.
But
Did it have glutes?
Oh,
yeah.
Tom, you're lucky Milo isn't here.
I had to do
Yeah,
it.
he had glutes. But yeah, I mean that was so peculiar. Now that when it stepped back, that was the first thing I was looking at was those pectoral muscles on the chest, and I was like, oh, this is because my first thought was, why is my window black? I'm not seeing anything out my window. And then of course when I started pounding on the window, when I first, I've told y'all this story before. When it first happened, I thought it was a horse scratching his butt on the back of the, because at that point in time I had loose horses around the cabin, and I thought that was what it was, and I was kind of like beating on the wall with my hand to tell him to stop doing that. But then when I saw my cat's reaction, and I kind of really started looking out the window and wondering why is it all black out there, and when I kept hitting the wall, and it kind of stepped back, and that's when the light filtered through, and I could see. I was like, "Oh shit, this is not." Oh, excuse me. This is not what I thought it was.
Potty mouth.
Yeah, my potty
It
mouth
happens.
just came
Hey,
out.
Forrest, let me ask you this. It's a hypothetical question. Do you think that you're the only person in Texas? Do you think you're the only person in your area who've seen these things?
Oh, Beck, I know I'm not.
I know.
I know I'm not. I mean, we have historical accounts here in this area of them being here, and then there's actually newspaper accounts back in the 60s that people were reporting them out at Lake Buchanan. And but I think there still is the stigma that a lot of people are afraid to say anything because somebody's going to belittle them or make fun of them or something. You know what? To put it frankly, I'm too damn old to give a damn. So
it kind of goes
there
back.
Goes my potty mouth again.
It kind of goes back.
I just don't care.
It kind of goes back to those two truths we were talking about at the beginning, where if officials they did a pretty good job. All these people at official positions, and mostly, maybe the few scientists that spoke out, maybe they had credentials, but they still were really against the topic because they didn't want to believe it. They weren't following science, which is supposed to be their job. They were following what their personal beliefs were and stuck by that. So the average person out there says, well, if Dr. So-and-so or Professor so-and-so said this, it must be real. And that's because, we as people, we don't spend a lot of time focusing on little things unless it's important to us, for some particular outcome we desire or what have you. But, something comes across us and you say to yourself, that can't be. And then Professor so-and-so says it can't be. Well, okay. And that's your frame of reference. You pack that away in your brain and on you go to the next thing. We're very transitory in our thinking. There's always something going on in front of us. So I think that's where a lot of that comes from, where, those of us that have seen the creatures, we know they're out there because we've seen them. And then there's...
You know what I find interesting?
Yeah.
Another group of people that I find that are very, very open to the existence of these creatures, and not only open to it, but fascinated, they want to hear more about it, are professionals in the medical field, scientists, that sort of thing. I'm just speaking from my own experience. My recent umpteen zillion visits to doctors and hospitals and whatnot, to a T, they're all fascinated by the topic and they want to hear more. It's, it's something that's, they don't belittle it, and they don't discount it.
You know, the image comes to mind of Tom having a tent set up out in front of the hospital where he's preaching the gospel of Bigfoot.
Yeah, I got to draw the line somewhere.
And you've got all these people in white coats in there, you know, singing the praises and everything, Tom. Sorry, that just popped in my head.
Right. No, I thought about that too, honestly. Not about having a tent, but
you got to have the tent.
Got to have a tent, yeah. But when I'm in there and I have a captive audience, and it goes back to, it's not what you say so much as how you say what you say.
How you say it.
Yes, with conviction.
Presentation is
versus,
everything.
Yeah, just regurgitating something that you've heard and believe in.
Well, Tom and you and I have talked about this a lot of times, and I don't you not remember the account that I gave you of my neurosurgeon? I mean, this guy graduated magna cum laude from 2 different universities, and when I started talking about Bigfoot, he actually hopped up on the exam table while I'm sitting in the chair and proceeds to listen to me go on for about 15 minutes about Bigfoot. And he was just like a little kid sitting there just soaking it up. And I'm like thinking in the back of my mind, I know he's got other patients than me, you know. But he was totally captivated about the subject. And he's like, we need to talk about this some more sometime.
Well,
that's almost an identical experience that I had with my oncologist and blah, blah, blah. The only thing is, when he hopped up on your table, was he kicking his legs back and forth like a little kid?
Yes, he was, as a matter of fact.
You know, surprisingly, that happens with some professional people. I know we know quite a few people in law enforcement, and I was even on the show of one of the guys. He's a retired deputy sheriff now, who his thing is ghosts, which is interesting. I mean, you wouldn't think somebody who was an officer of the law would be involved in that kind of stuff, but and just a little side trip is I used to manage the Northern California. Can't think what it was called, but it was for a company I used to work for. I was the Northern California manager of their region here, and when they wanted me to go on that $10 million Bigfoot bounty, I called my director of operations in the East, and I told her, what they wanted me for the show, but I wasn't real big on doing it. And she says, no, you can take a leave of absence and go do that if you want to. I mean, I hadn't been with the company that long, so I didn't feel like I should be asking for any time off. And then come to find out she was interested in ghosts. And here's the director of operations for this big, this corporation. And I thought, we had a great chat. It kind of broke down the boundaries, the formal boundaries of the job. And it's funny. I mean, you run across people, but the same thing with this law enforcement person. He had a podcast, and I actually did an episode on his show once. But the same thing, we have people come over, that are all these law enforcement people, and oftentimes they're very interested in the topic when they're people you would never consider as even looking twice at something like that.
That's been our experience, Will, that quite often these people that are in law enforcement, higher education, not excluding the other groups, but groups that you would kind of think of as being more straight-laced, are actually the ones that are riveted.
I've had several biologists contact me, that were fascinated, lawyers, you name it. There's people in all these professions, and I find it refreshing that they're very open to this. They want to know more about it.
They do. And I think, again, it goes back to, it's not just what they hear, but how they hear and who they hear it from. When they hear it from not only a credible witness, but how it's said versus what's said. If you say it with a snicker, they're gonna shut off immediately.
That sets up the situation right away. And if you do any studying about interviewing, that kind of tells you how to approach a situation. If you however you want the outcome is how you initiate that contact. So
Yeah, exactly.
I picked it up a long time ago. I told you that my friend Carlo and I would go to the field together, and usually we'd stop for breakfast in the Columbia River Gorge somewhere on our way, and discuss kind of what the plan was for the day and everything. And I used to think, in fact, one time I mentioned to him, I said, "Look, there's 30 people sitting in here, something like that," and I said, "I wonder how many people out of this group has either had an encounter themselves or they know someone personally who has." So I made a point of, and it's something you have to force yourself to do most often, to get up and go introduce yourself to a total stranger, and then tell them, "Hey, I'm a Bigfoot researcher. Have you ever seen one, or do you know someone who has?" And not one time did I ever get laughed at. Never. People are always either very positive or on occasion they'd say, "Well, I don't know anybody," but they'd say, I find that a fascinating topic.
One thing I've noticed in the last couple of years is that the whole subject of Bigfoot it's not taboo anymore. And I think there's more and more people out there who may not have had an encounter, but they hear of these encounters and they hear these stories, and a lot of times you're not laughed at anymore.
Yeah,
with what you've seen.
You're right. It's they seem to want to know more about it. People, and I think the majority of people are on the fence. And if you can show them something that's reasonable and credible, they'll say, "Okay, I can understand that," instead of just shutting you down like it used to be.
Well, you've got all these shows on TV now about Bigfoot, so I think people are becoming more open to it just from that.
That's part of it, but I also think that most of those people are saying, the people I see out there making comments about these things know these people are full of baloney, but they're interested in the topic.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and on a parallel, not even a parallel topic, but another kind of a cryptid type topic, you look at the whistleblowers like David Grush and some of the others out there, and that's starting to come out, and it's being generally accepted. Well,
I think people, it's so much more widespread that people see things in the skies. And to me, I haven't seen anything, but I hear people, sometimes it's interesting to watch these things and what people have to say. Because instead of like with our topic, people will make these pronouncements, and I say to myself, well, I know better than that, and I'll dig a little bit deeper into something. So I thought, well, if you use the same methodology with the UFO topic, for example, let me dig a little bit deeper into what they're saying. And some of these people, there's just too many people. I mean, what I want to get around to was the first thing that got me was, okay, you'd have the witness describing something in very, very good detail, good quality detail. They talked about how close it was and all the things it did, all that stuff. Then there were the naysayers that would say, well, no, they were seeing points of light in the sky or Venus. Completely contradictory to what the witness was saying.
Well, not only that, those people, they exist and they're everywhere, and I think they get their juice off of, riding the coattails of whether it's a UFO topic or a Bigfoot topic. And very quickly, very early on, I would listen to them. I'd give them, consideration. I'd say, well, that's interesting. I said, now when I was out there and when I saw mine, my truck was here and my buddy's truck was there. Now, where were you parked at? Because I don't remember. Oh, you weren't out there. Okay.
Well, that's the whole thing. I mean, a lot of these shows used to be, they would show the people who saw something, whether it was our topic or UFOs or what have you. Then they would always have to have the people who were the naysayers, to get, and I know their idea was to give the audience both sides of an argument, let them choose, right? But the people who were the naysayers had a kind of a built-in place on these shows, regardless of what harebrained ideas they had about it. And that's kind of where they got their traction.
You want to talk about the naysayers on these shows for a second. I'm not going to mention this show, but there's one that we all know. It's probably the most iconic, popular TV show on the topic. And I saw an interview with one of the members of this show. And hey, look, I cannot begrudge these guys for getting paid to go out and do what they do. They knew darn good and well that a lot of what they were doing was just simply television, it was theater. But off the air, off the record, this one guy was being interviewed, and there's 4 panel members who go out into the woods and look for these things, and one of them was the consummate skeptic. Off the record, this one guy was saying, well, that person actually does believe they exist, but here's what they believe they are. And I found that to be very interesting. So on the show, hey, you want to get a big fat paycheck, you got to do what you're told. But off the show, you still have your own beliefs.
Yeah, I think a lot of
Tom, you're right about that. Tom, I was going to say, you're exactly right. I actually had the pleasure of meeting that person and speaking to that person, and I was told the same thing by that person. So,
yeah,
that you're right about that.
And there was another episode where I saw that they had intentionally derailed, belittled, and frankly ridiculed one of the witnesses, saying, well, that behavior is behavior that we've never heard of before. It couldn't have been, so you must have seen something else. Off the record, months later, another one of the people who was on that show was being interviewed just by a couple of his buddies on a YouTube channel. And he said, you know what? They were wrong. The so-called expert said, oh, yeah, this, I don't remember what it was. I think it was a broken branch or something like that. Pronounced that this was done within the last 2 weeks, and they did it just for the benefit of the show. And he said, no, I saw that broken branch, this area, and this was, months ago, if not a year or so ago. And it's the same one. So when they said it was just done recently, it wasn't. And part of the behavior, not all of it, but part of the behavior that Bigfoot does not do was run alongside a vehicle trying to look in the window, as I recall. Now, have we ever heard of any such craziness like that?
Like that. I interviewed someone, probably 10 years ago, that had that exact encounter. And this was in, I want to say, Alabama. Could have been, or Alabama or Mississippi, one of the two places. But broad daylight, the creature ran next to the pickup. Yeah. I mean, and Green wrote about it in his book. He had stories of the same thing happening.
We've heard, I want to say 20%, minimum 20% of the stories and encounters of credible witnesses that we've spoken with have that very same thing, including TW. TW right. mentioned that they had a situation like that. And it wasn't trotting along at 15, 20 miles an hour. It was going, you have a better idea of how fast it was going, but it was scooting right along there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of shows you kind of a cross-section, of people doing these shows where you have, all these different opinions and intent with the show. And I can say this very clearly with our team, when we're in the field, we'll pick something apart right there. And by the time, Adam has recorded it, we've come to a consensus about what it is that occurred in that place. There aren't these really dissenting ideas because we've picked it apart and thought very thoroughly about what we found.
Will, talking about that, you brought up a point that was totally obvious that I hadn't really made quite that connection. And this was last summer when we were going to all the different areas here in Oregon, mm-hmm. and we would see the tree breaks. And you pointed out that you don't see these, if it was just
if it was natural,
a weather break, yeah, it was just natural. You would see it everywhere, but you don't. You only see it in areas where Bigfoot is.
Yeah, we were moving to about a 30-mile distant location to look at another area with there was some water and some other features we wanted to look at there. And I told everybody, I said, well, don't discuss it along the way. But, and this was at the place we found those fresh trees that were snapped over. I said, keep your eyes open and count how many of these you see between here and that point 30 miles away. And once we got to that area, we discussed it. And remember, no one had seen a single one. So it's every bit as important what you don't see as what you do see sometimes. Everybody got silent.
It's food for thought.
It is, but it was, the point was, if it was natural, you would see it often and in abundance, because the weather isn't going to hit one little spot and not 30 miles of a stretch of an area. You would see things like that, and we didn't. We only saw it in the places where there was activity happening.
And it happened in such a way, you would see a tree break consistently. They were between 7.5 to 8 feet off the ground on typically a Doug fir or those cedars.
And broken in exactly the same fashion.
In the same fashion, and you could see up top, you found it, nobody else did, where the creature had held with its hand and just snapped it over.
I got that.
That cannot happen. It would happen to all the other trees next to it if it was a windbreak or a snow break or something like that, but it wasn't.
Well, in my thinking, this started back around the time we were doing the whole Yakult investigation. Actually, prior to that, it would have been, it would have been around the same time. In Yakult, we didn't find so much the tree breaks. Of course, I wasn't looking for them yet then. That was 89 and 90. When I first found the really pronounced ones was in 91. And this was after a visit to Bob Titmus's house, and we had our discussion. He showed me the things he found and how he found them and all that. And I didn't think much of it until we actually climbed up that slope above the Washougal River watershed. And then I found the line of them. We counted 13 of them in that line. But the first one, it was a slap across the head. It was so different. It didn't belong out there. And then I wanted to rule out any possibility. I thought, well, could a bear do that? Could this do that? So I started examining the trunk very carefully. And I always carry, even, it looks funny because it kind of goes back to the whole, kind of the Sherlock Holmes image, the magnifying glass. And I get the magnifying glass out and I'm inspecting the bark very carefully to see if there's hair, what kind of hair it is, if there's claw marks, teeth marks, any indication of what would have caused this. And from then on, I look all the time, because sometimes you can see where that big hand has grabbed the bark and it kind of presses it, and it leaves that impression on that bark.
The very first evidence of my first encounter that I had, and I'm trying to remember which book it was one of your first two books where you talk about the tree breaks. Is it Bigfoot 101 or?
I've done it in several of them, so I don't recall offhand, but probably Notes from the Field.
Yeah, I think that's it. And had I not read that, I would have driven right past it. And this was
who would think
in
twice
that very
about it?
Area. Wouldn't have thought twice about it. But it was an area that we were above the snow line. Got my Christmas tree. I've told this story too many times, but driving back, I see all these trees along the side of the road, and just one of them is snapped over like that. And I made a mental note of it, and that's where we got below. That's where I had that first encounter where, we got below the snow line, had one schlocky, jinky little headlamp to try to undo the chains on my truck when it's dark, cold, and damp out. And that's where we had the first encounter. But, yeah, it was...
My brother-in-law and my buddies and I found some trees that were snapped over like that, but they were really high. And I just couldn't, in my mind, for some reason, come to the reality of what was going on for a minute until I thought about it. Of course, we were up there in the middle of summer, the only time you can drive up into this area, because the snow is so deep up there. Snow will get, up to 10 feet deep up there in the wintertime. This is just outside of Mount Rainier National Park. And then it dawned on me, if the snow were on, then whatever did that would be 10 feet higher, because the breaks were like 20, 25 feet off the ground. And I thought, now it makes sense, because they were identical to the ones we normally find, that are 7, 8 feet off the ground.
I have one, and this goes back to just taking pictures of anything and everything and then just storing them somewhere for future reference. But I had one, I was up there with a couple of guys, and I just took a picture of it, and he goes, wow, yeah, sure. You know, it was 15, 18 feet off the ground. He goes, boy, that'd be a big one, wouldn't it? I was being sarcastic.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, I just take pictures of everything, and that makes sense.
It goes back to context.
We were there in the summertime. You go there in the wintertime, well, you're not going to get there in the wintertime.
Right.
It's just not going to happen.
It's like the breaks I mentioned. You could tell they weren't fresh. And I thought, okay, these are probably last year. But they were the very, very classic break. I mean, they weren't weather broken because of where they were and everything. And I thought, oh, duh. There would have been 10 feet of snow on the ground up here. You know, and oftentimes that area, we go hiking up there, and oftentimes even in the middle of July when it's hot, there are still in the shaded areas patches of, you know, a couple of feet of snow left.
Well, snowfields.
Yeah.
There was one tree break that I found where it was clearly snapped over for no good reason. All the other trees should have been. And then about 3-4 feet away was another tree, same dimensions. It had been broken over, and you could tell, and it started to grow back, but you could tell it had been done years and years ago, years earlier. Mm-hmm. So it was like...
Sometimes you find those.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, they frequent this area. Now, it pointed to a lake, and in the Chinook language, that lake meant death.
Oh,
like,
that's not good.
Okay, so, yeah, I was going to get my brother. He does mountain climbing. We're going to get mountain climbing gear, and because the slope is so steep, you can get down there no problem. Gravity assist. Yeah, getting out of there, especially if you need to get out in a hurry. We never did it, and I'm glad we didn't. But very interesting, and pointing in the same direction. And if you took a look at it and stood there, you'd say, well, why only these two trees and not any of the others?
Yeah,
makes no sense.
That's something we'll have to really start doing in the field is, you know, getting an azimuth on what direction those breaks, and seeing if it means anything. It may not. We don't know yet.
Well, I do. I take a GPS reading. I take magnetic declination corrected for the azimuth. And I've done enough of them where I think I was able to connect a handful of them. There's one here, maybe 100, 110 yards away. There's another one pointing. There's a line is what it boils down to. And the very last one that I was going to take a look at pointed to the Lake of Death. That was the last one. I wasn't going to go down to look any further.
Yeah, I think I would have left on that one too.
Right?
The point of death, Lake of Death. I'll avoid that one. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, guys, we're starting to run a little short on time. Any final thoughts before we wrap this session up? Everybody's silent again.
Another good show.
All right, everyone. Well, listen, we'll conclude this session. Thanks for stopping by. And if anybody wants to sit in on these sessions, get a hold of us, and you're more than welcome to join us.
Oh, one thing that reminds me of something. If you have a question that you want to shoot our direction for questions and answers, it's pretty easy. It's just questions@creekdevil.com. So fire up your email, questions@creekdevil.com. And if we don't get to it in a timely fashion, shoot us another one, slap us in the face and say, hey, where were you? Come on now.
All right, everyone. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning, @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes eyes open out there.